When most of us picture nuns, we picture quiet cloisters, candles, whispered prayers, and the soft swing of a rosary. We picture a sanctuary, but history often hides its sharp edges behind holy curtains, and the story I want to tell you today lives in that shadow. The most horrifying punishments that were inflicted on nuns who broke their vows. This isn't sensationalism. This is real pain, real humiliation, and real cruelty, sanctioned, or at least tolerated, by church authorities and convent leaders across centuries and continents. And the lesson buried in these stories is brutal. When power wears a habit, mercy can sometimes be the first casualty. Let's begin with the stakes. When a woman took the veil, whether at age 12 or 30, she entered a contract that was part legal, part spiritual. Poverty, chastity, and obedience were not just private choices. They were public commitments, witnessed by God, the local bishop, and often sealed by dowries and property gifts. Break those vows, and you didn't just disappoint a superior, you were accused of betraying God and community. The language used to describe transgressions was fierce: scandal, sacrilege, spiritual adultery. In a society where religion ordered daily life, a nun's transgression threatened more than a single person's reputation. It threatened the moral order of the community. So what happened when those vows were broken? The punishments ranged from ritualized shaming to slow psychological death, and in some rare but recorded cases, to physical annihilation. Below, I'll walk you through the most horrifying examples historians have found, what they looked like, why they were done, and what they tell us about power, gender, and religion. Public shaming was the most common first step. If a nun was accused of an illicit relationship, gossip spelled her doom. She would be stripped of her veil, the symbol of her consecration, and forced to stand before her sisters, bareheaded and humiliated. Sometimes her hair was cut short in a violent shearing, the habit, the marker of her identity, gone in an instant. In some houses, the abbess led a procession outside the chapel. The disgraced sister might be made to wear sackcloth or to sing penitential psalms while others passed by. The point was unmistakable. Your sacred identity has been revoked. But public humiliation often slid into physical punishment. Corporal discipline, the discipline, meant lashes. In many convents, the superior, or an appointed sister, would flog the offender with a belt or a small lash. These acts were framed as penance, a way to purify the flesh, to save the soul. Imagine the cognitive contortions required. The same community that taught charity and mercy now administered blows and called it healing. The lash was both retribution and theater. Community witnesses saw the body marked, repentance displayed, order restored. In more extreme cases, convents turned to devices designed specifically to silence and humiliate: gags, metal bits, or bridles. Historically, scolds' bridles, iron masks, or gag bits used in secular Europe to silence women accused of nagging or slander, sometimes had analogues in ecclesiastical discipline. Accounts from Spain and Italy mention gagging as punishment for gossiping or defiance. To be muzzled inside a convent was to lose voice and identity. The bridle was not only practical cruelty, it was symbolic domination. You are not permitted to speak, and your silence is now visible to the whole community. Confinement is where punishment often becomes a slow erasure. Solitary cells inside convents, tiny punishment cells, were used to isolate nuns who refused to admit guilt or who continued to defy authority. These cells could be narrow, windowless, and barely ventilated. Food was minimal: stale bread, thin soup, perhaps a cup of water. The psychological effect was devastating. Social beings deprived of human contact experience a slow unraveling of mind and spirit. Prisoners in such cells sometimes suffered insanity or death by neglect. These confinements were presented as penitential solitude. In reality, they were punishment by invisibility. Even more terrifying are the accounts, rare, debated, but persistent, of immurement, the walled-up cell. Immurement shows up more often in secular criminal punishment records than in convent archives, and historians disagree about how frequently it was applied to nuns. Yet chronicles and local administrative notes from parts of Italy and Germany hint that immurement was occasionally used against women whose crimes were seen as not only moral but socially destabilizing. Unwed pregnancies, illicit liaisons, or scandals that threatened powerful patrons. To be bricked into a tiny chamber was social erasure. The woman lived, in theory, but was removed from liturgy, community, and family forever. Closely related to immurement is enforced fasting and starvation. The rhetoric of penance valorized hunger. To starve the body was to feed the spirit, but penance too often crossed into abuse. Records from both Europe and colonial Latin America describe nuns given so little to eat that they wasted away. Some superiors ordered strict fasts for months on end, either as punishment or as a purification. Starvation as discipline was slow cruelty dressed as sanctity. Sexual violence, too, sits like a shadow across many of these accounts. Older histories sometimes glossed over the sexual exploitation of nuns. More recent scholarship has revealed that male clergy, confessors, and outside officials could and did abuse their power. When nuns resisted, punishment could follow: forced confessions, public shame, or solitary confinement. At times, accusations of promiscuity were manufactured to justify control and to silence women who had knowledge or influence that threatened the male hierarchy. The dynamic is stark. Sexual transgression, imagined or real, became the pretext to obliterate a woman's social standing. We also need to speak about forced ingestion, a punishment that by its very nature attacks dignity and the body's border. In some convents, disobedient sisters were made to swallow bitter tonics, ash, or soap, symbolic cleansings that in practice caused nausea, vomiting, dehydration, and sometimes chemical injury to mouth and throat. In Spanish Inquisition-era documents, you find references to culinary penances, humiliating meals laced with bitter herbs or ashes, used as correction. The idea was that if the mouth had sinned, it must be made to suffer. The result was physical degradation masquerading as therapy. Let's bring these patterns to life with a few names, because names make history human. Benedetta Carlini, an early 17th century Italian nun, is a well-documented case. A mystic and stigmatic in the convent of Villano, Benedetta claimed religious visions and spiritual ecstasies that made her prominent until allegations of sexual intimacy with another nun surfaced. The church took the affair seriously. Benedetta was questioned by the Inquisition and ultimately confined. She spent the rest of her life incarcerated within ecclesiastical walls. Her case illustrates how alleged sexual transgression, mixed with the politics of mysticism and male clerical oversight, could permanently remove a woman from community and service. Another vivid example is Mariana de Leyva, the real woman behind the famed Nun of Monza. Her life, fictionalized in Alessandro Manzoni's novel, offers a window into how a young woman forced into the convent by family pressures could be both victim and transgressor in a world that had little mercy. Mariana's illicit relationships and the political entanglements of her patrons led to scandal. She was confined and controlled, and her reputation was effectively destroyed, while influential men often escaped similar disgrace. Her story shows the gendered double standard. A woman's fall became public drama, while male protectors avoided equal scrutiny. The Loudun possessions of 1634 are a different kind of cautionary tale. In this French episode, Ursuline nuns were said to be possessed. The scandal ensnared Father Urbain Grandier, who was tried and executed for witchcraft. The nuns themselves were subjected to interrogation and observation. Some were temporarily confined, and later accounts question the reliability of their confessions. Loudun demonstrates how cultural panic, political rivalries, and ecclesiastical interest could convert convent behavior into charges that served wider agendas, and how the convent's women could be either instruments of or victims in those struggles. Geography mattered. In Spain and Portugal, where the Inquisition's power sometimes intersected with convent life, discipline could be especially severe. Conventional punishments might be used to control property disputes and family alliances. In colonial Latin America, convents often became microcosms of imperial power, where punishment was both ecclesiastical and colonial. Discipline could take harsher forms, where oversight was minimal and social hierarchies were rigid. In Protestant regions, responses were different, but silencing and shaming remained tools to enforce conformity. Now the twist: these punishments were not simply about enforcing vows or protecting sanctity. They were about control of property, of family ambitions, of women's sexuality, and of social order. Convents often held land, wealth, and influence. Families that placed daughters in convents expected obedience in return for patronage. When a nun deviated, it threatened networks that reached beyond the cloister. Punishment, therefore, became as much a political choice as a religious discipline. The instruments of penance were often the instruments of control. Humiliation erased claims on dowries. Confinement neutralized inconvenient testimonies. Forced confessions shifted blame away from powerful men. We must also remember there was resistance. Not all nuns obediently accepted mistreatment. Some smuggled letters to bishops, appealed to relatives, or escaped. There are records of nuns revolting against abusive abbesses, bringing charges of corruption and forcing outside investigations. Those moments of rebellion remind us that even in institutions built to silence women, women found ways to speak and to resist. So what is the takeaway for today? First, that institutions, even sacred ones, are not immune to corruption. The same structures that fostered learning, charity, and care could be twisted to hide cruelty, especially where secrecy and hierarchical power combined. Second, that the most vulnerable, girls forced into cloisters for economic or social reasons, women without family support, minorities, often paid the highest price. And finally, that remembering these stories matters. Uncovering the ways women were silenced and punished helps us ask better questions about power and accountability in our own institutions. One more detail worth noting: the scold's bridle, a metal mask or bit used to silence women accused of being quarrelsome, deserves a specific mention. While more common in secular punishments, variations of this device turned up around convent discipline as well. The bridle is a brutal metaphor. It physically prevents speech while simultaneously signaling social control. To see a woman muzzled in this way was to watch the literal removal of voice and agency. If any of this has left you unsettled, that's as it should be. The point is not to sensationalize, but to remember. These women deserve our attention. Their suffering is part of a long human story about power and the ways it can be justified with holy language. By naming these practices and the women affected by them, we restore a measure of dignity and bear witness to injustice.